I'm Cindy Blackstock, and I am a member of the Gitxsan First Nation, an executive director with the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, and I'm also an associate professor at the University of Alberta. You know, what a lot of people don't understand is that First Nations children residing on reserve get less funding for every public service compared to other children. The reason for this inequality is that although provincial education, health, and child welfare laws apply on and off reserve, the federal government of Canada pays for services like education on reserve, whereas it's paid by the provincial governments for all other children and young people in Canada. And as the Auditor General and many others have noted, in almost every area of First Nations children's experience, they get between 20 and 30% less funding than non-Aboriginal children. And this has been going on for decades. Right, and so when we look at how much the underfunding is, it varies according to whatever province you're in and territory you're in. But generally what we say is about roughly 30% less than what non-Aboriginal children get. And that needs to be viewed within the longer history of residential schools. Think about it, the last residential school only closed in 1996. And those schools where First Nations children were forcibly removed from their families and put into these institutions that were meant to really, as the Government of Canada said, get rid of the Indian in the child. It was to raise them as if they were somebody else. And so education does not have a very good reputation, at least non-Aboriginal education, in many First Nations communities. Knowledge, however, does, and traditional knowledge does. And people are recouping that wanting a proper education, one where they don't have to sacrifice who they are, but also prepares them for the dreams that they might have in terms of a career. But when you're getting 30% less, and you're dealing with this added hardship of the multi-generational impacts of residential schools, you can imagine how difficult it is for any student to succeed in those circumstances. You know, just today at lunch, I was having a conversation with two young women who are now 13 years old. They, at age 4, joined a campaign for getting a proper school in their community, because the school in their First Nation, Attawapiskat, sat on top of a toxic waste dump and was replaced by portable trailers that were so run down that there would be ice buildup on the doorways and the heat would go off. Black mold contamination. There was no library. Finally, thanks to a great hero named Shannon Kustachin, who started a campaign to raise awareness amongst Canadians of what it's like to try to learn in that kind of environment, they finally got a school, and these two girls were the valedictorians. But what they're saying is, even though they finally got a proper school, they know many First Nations children and young people don't, and they don't have the same level of funding for teachers, for resources and learning, for computers that all other kids get. And so they want to go on to university. But in order to get there, they know that they have to leave their homes at 13 years of age, or getting ready to leave home and go hundreds of miles away off reserve to go to a school that's properly funded. Now, for many parents and even some of young people watching, the idea of having to leave home to go to school because the school in your community is so underfunded that you would have very little chance of going to post-secondary is unthinkable. And yet it's a reality in the lives of so many First Nations children, young people in this country. You know, I think if one of the things I say to post-secondary students is that the Department of Indian Affairs funding formula was created way back in the 1980s, before the World Wide Web was online. And it includes no funding for libraries and no funding for computers. And when I look out and I see my students in post-secondary, I say, how many of you would actually think you would have been here if you had no libraries and no computers? Just that one inequality in and of itself. And most of them say, I wouldn't have made it. That's the impact, is that we're really robbing children of an opportunity to live the lives they wish to have. And the other sad thing is that many First Nations children don't know they're being treated unequally. So sometimes they take on board the idea that it's their problem. They're not smart enough, they're not trying hard enough. And they internalize the racism as if it is them. And because many non-Aboriginal Canadians are not aware of this inequality, and in fact many believe that First Nations children on reserve get more services than everybody else, you have a child getting less, but being judged as if they're getting more. And that makes that feeling of inadequacy even stronger in many of these children and young people. And it is not about them. They are just as smart, just as eager to learn, just as committed to making it a better world than any other child. The only difference is that they get less because of their race, and that needs to end. This inequality for children on reserve is Canada's Confederate flag, and it needs to be taken down. We don't have good national data. What we do know is that First Nations children are less than half as likely to graduate from high school as non-Aboriginal children because of these inequalities. You know, if you think about the two young women that I just met with in Attawapiskat, I mean, if you think about yourself, how likely would it have been that you would have stuck it out in school when the heat's turning off and it's 40 below zero outside, and there's black mold contamination, and there's no learning resources? I think for any of us, regardless of how much we want to learn, those barriers would start to pile up on us. And especially when we think about those inequalities in education in that broader arena of inequality. Those children at Attawapiskat would go home, many of them, to homes that did not have potable water, that in homes that were overcrowded, or some were living in tents. And so trying to learn and succeed when across every area of your experience, the Government of Canada is sending you a message that you're not worth the money is very difficult.